I'm very grateful for that introduction. I should say, as head of state, I have been attending some parts of the recent discussions at the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals, issues of global poverty. Of course, the meeting that will take place in Paris in November, December, will be very, very important for all of us. But here on the west coast, I might think Seattle and Galway on the west coast of Ireland are twin cities. And of course, if the sea that brought us together at the end of the 19th century was important then, it is even more important now as we look to the maritime setting for new possibilities for a sustainable future. It's a great pleasure to hear as well of the university's new reputation, its established reputation. I think that for me to be in a university that shares with some of our third level institutes in Ireland a scientific and policy interest in the great oceans that link all life on this planet, and the care which must be at the centre of our future actions in building sustainable connections between economy, ecology and ethics. And it is essential, I think, in approaching what I have to say today, to stress that connection. In a way, many of our current difficulties, both in terms of climate impact and also in terms of technology gone wrong, has been the loss of connection between economy, ecology, and ethics. This is a topic I have spoken about before. Research and responsible science here and in your sister universities has, I believe, for example, in the case that I instanced, ensured that our oceans can be preserved for future generations. But I want to suggest that we must all be open, if we are to achieve this, to defining our tasks anew. And also, I think, as well, in being willing to debate and reconsider what we mean by the concept of development itself. And I think we must all face the challenge, too, of changing our practices. So the title I've given to what I have to say this morning is Redefining Development and Taking Responsibility for Climate Change and the Challenge to Science and Technology in New Circumstances. I want to say at the very outset, as I look around the room, it was one of the great liberating experiences to myself to study at a university and to become a university teacher. I very much welcome, it's one of the innovations I've made as president, is that I take opportunities of engaging as head of state with students and faculty. And I think that the issues that we have been discussing in 2015 are of immense significance. It's a very, very important year. The issues are of great importance to all of humanity. And I have to say, and meeting some of your faculty and meeting you as students, it is a very, very great, not just a responsibility, but a wonderful opportunity to be a university teacher. I was, as you have heard in the introduction, the first member of my family to attend university when I studied at University College Galway in the 1960s. It's just over half a century ago when I came to the United States first, to Indiana University. I had been accepted in Berkeley, but they had allocated all of their money, so I went to RU instead, and then later, I taught at Southern Illinois University. But through my life, I have been absolutely convinced of the importance of public engaged scholarship and of the public university as a cornerstone of democratic society. And thus I want to begin by expressing my delight at having the opportunity to be here today at one of the great institutions of that public university tradition, the University of Washington. As I said, the theme I have chosen, development and climate change and the role of science and technology and access to technology can play in addressing these issues, is quite deliberate. It's a debate that is now underway in Europe. It's a debate that is taking place internationally. And there are some practical issues that immediately arise. For example, the application of technology within a model of development is never neutral. It has never been neutral. When I began considering this topic a long time ago, I regularly quoted Francis Bacon, who, if you like, spoke about the relationship between development and nature. I lead to you nature and her children in bondage for your use, to gouge out her secrets. And you just have all the prejudices located there in relation to ecology, in relation to gender, in relation to domination. And of course, that great thrust of the idea of progress was carried within a model of colonization and imperium, and which also assumed parts of our planet that were inhabited by people who at least were inefficient in their use of the resources available to them. This is a reality. And I think that I really strongly contest those, as I will in my paper to say, that the issues we now face today are issues that can be solved by technocratic commitment. They cannot. They are inescapably issues of political and moral significance, which is why I, as a head of state, am taking interest in this topic. I think as well, if in fact the issues of the application of technology can never be neutral, what this suggests to us is that a model of development can neither be neutral, and an ethical consideration of the delivery requires a consideration of context and consequence. It is appropriate then to address this issue in Washington and at this university, as I've said, one of the premier research universities in the United States, and also a university for which I congratulate you, with such a strong profile in achieving sustainability on its campus. By having, if you like, an ethos within your own system, you're not only contributing to the knowledge that will be necessary to address climate change, but you become an exemplar of the type of action and process that all of us must engage in as we manage change, not as passive consumers, but as agent innovators of change, for that is really what is required. There is an extraordinary quiescence sometimes that flows through populations, not unrelated to affluence and the consumer society, as Zygmunt Bauman would have put it. But I don't believe that this is necessarily inevitable or that it cannot be disrupted. As President of Ireland, I want to emphasize that the area of research, scientific research, and technological advancement generally is of special interest to us in Ireland, and to our society and to our economy. And I very much welcome that there has been a significant increase of investment in science and the promotion of science and education. It isn't only just a cornerstone of current economic policy in Ireland, but it has played a central role in our economic recovery. But of course, science and its application through technology has an importance far beyond the economic. It's one of my privileges as President of Ireland to go to the Young Scientist exhibition one year after another. And when I go and I see these young scientists, these youngsters, not much different in age, some of them a bit younger than yourselves, and as they bring their projects for exhibition, they are full of enthusiasm about the wonderment and the great enthusiasm for discovery about the phenomena of the planet and of things that are not only connected but are coming into existence as new relationships of the imagination. And I think, therefore, that creates a moral implication, it seems to me. They are citizens, and they are not there really only to prove that they can be useful for some form of model of economics, ecology, and society that is going to be offered to them. This is, in fact, one of the great problems of our time. I am very well aware that Ireland's reputation, too, is often and quite correctly associated with the fields of literature and the humanities. It's very interesting. The 19th century, 1911 census shows that 90% of the Irish people spoke the language you heard me speak at the beginning. By the end of that century, and often through compulsion, there's only 12% spoke that language as their first language. Some of them, for example, children, carried a signum which they hung around their neck, and if they spoke the Irish language at home, their parents were to put a notch in it, and they were punished in the English-speaking school for having spoken their native language. And therefore, what happens after that? The Irish continually reinventing themselves, win and take the English language and break the models of the novel and whatever, and within 50 years win 4 Nobel Prizes in literature writing in English. And of course, I always say we really should be 5 because you could count in Eugene O'Neill as well. But I think that if I say that, I think very often we don't emphasize sufficiently the very rich history of scientific work that is not as well known as it should be. The discoveries of Robert Boyle and William Rowan Hamilton may be well known, but there are so many others as well, such as John Tyndall, who suggested why the sky is blue, Nicholas Callan, who invented the induction coil, William Parsons, the third Earl of Ross, who continued a tradition in a family of science that goes right on to the present day. He who built the world's largest telescope and used it to locate new structures in the heavens. George Gabriel Stokes is another, who investigated the phenomenon of fluorescence and advanced the wave theory of light. William Thomson, the first Baron Kelvin, who contributed so much to the transatlantic telegraph project. John Lytton Singh, who pioneered the study of black holes. George Francis Fitzgerald, whose understanding of the laws of motion provided an essential building block for the special theory of relativity. And then, of course, very recently, I had the great pleasure as President of Ireland of writing to William Campbell of Ramilton and County Donegal and Trinity College Dublin, as well as Drew University, for sharing the 2015 Nobel Prize in Medicine. So it's another part of the intelligence as well to which the Irish people have been contributing, and doing so in an international way. And I'm so pleased to see so many people here who have retained or who have come from connections with Ireland. Science is central to every aspect of our contemporary lives. But today what I want to do, consider however briefly, is the role of science in general, and if you like, the delivery and of technology in particular, in the context of the current global considerations of sustainable development and, as you've heard, the challenge of climate change. This year, 2015, has been defined as a critical moment in world history, and parallels have been made with the year 1945. In that year, 1945, we marked a potential turning point in how humanity deals with some of its most fundamental challenges. In 1945, the tragedies of 2 world wars within a half century had shocked humanity and the international community, who had been forced to gaze on not only the carnage of war, but the collapse of the most basic standards of human behavior. And now, in a new century, we're faced with the persistence of global poverty, despite unbounded surplus, deepening inequality, including here in the United States, and uncontrolled and unregulated destruction of species and environments, as well as disruption of the balance, thank you, as nothing changes, but and as well as the balance between these species and our planet. If all human life was to aspire to us continuing as we are now, if we were to continue as we are now, we would need 6 planet Earths. And if our existing economic and fiscal models are to continue, we will continue to put servicing debt, for example, ahead of relieving major issues such as nutrition, hunger, education, shelter, gender equality, pluralism of thought, and sustainable peace itself. I sometimes wish I was your age again in relation to as you engage all of these issues. But it would be very dishonest of me as a public person and as a scholar in my day, have the thing to say that we can address any of the issues I speak of without being willing to change, and change fundamentally, intellectually, morally, practically, and in the way we define the purpose of our science, our technology, and our practice. And this year, 2015, is important for us in enabling us to change direction. Yes, the successful agreement of the new Sustainable Development Goals by members of the United Nations recently in New York, I think that will hopefully be followed by the positive conclusion of a comprehensive climate change agreement in Paris in December. But that conference has been described correctly as the last chance of a generation such as mine for an effective joint response to climate change before irreversible degradation of our environment takes place. The Sustainable Development Goals, which have been agreed in New York, set out 17 goals and 169 targets that are aimed at addressing global hunger and poverty before the period of 2030. The goals speak to governments as primary duty holders, and it calls on them to act in solidarity. The goals speak to business and capital about responsibilities both in the short and long term, and to those institutions that might regulate them, including institutions that must come into existence, and about how they might support sustainable development. The goals also speak to us all as citizens on the responsibilities we must assume if we are to change how we live and how the patterns of our consumption. The new Sustainable Development Goals, of course, replace the Millennium Development Goals that framed the period 2000 to 2015. And one of the main changes, of course, though, however, from the previous goals and the present ones recently agreed in New York, is that the new goals are universal in both their reach and obligation. They're aimed at all governments and citizens in all regions of the world. And achieving sustainable development is now seen for the period to come, to 2030, as something that carries obligations and duties in every region. The previous 15 years might have been aimed, as it were, at what we call the developing or undeveloped world. The new goals are aimed at all of us. This universal approach is a recognition that in a globalized world, problems and their solutions can only be defined, understood, faced at global level. And one is left, of course, with the fundamental challenge that at institutional, diplomatic, and democratic level, we are faced with a dilemma. That dilemma is what we're left with is that elected governments are responsible for an ever-decreasing portion of the decisions that are taken in the global economic space. Then too, while accountability can be demanded from states and their elected representatives, many dominant multinational corporations are opposed even to regulation of the type that has, if you like, an importance, the type that is necessary. And bearing in mind, if we wanted illustration, that it is estimated that just 90 large companies alone have contributed nearly 2/3 of man-made carbon emissions, this important challenge of accountability must be appreciated. The balance of accountability is crucial. Yes, elected politicians will meet citizens who will even be concerned, and elected people can take the abuse. But then the stealth of power locked in those who are not accountable at all will cast a continue. This is an issue that can no longer be avoided. It is an issue that arises internationally and within states. The central global problem addressed in the Sustainable Development Goals is that, of course, we've been discussing it in New York, but also in Addis Ababa, is one of global poverty, which remains depressingly persistent despite the efforts of governments and development organizations over recent decades. Indeed, the fact of a newly deepening inequality and of its consequences in terms of deprivation and public health consequences is in fact overwhelming. In January of this year, the British NGO Oxfam published a research report projecting that by 2016, next year, the wealthiest 1% of the global population, who in 2014, just last year, owned 48% of global wealth, would possess as much wealth as the remaining 99% combined. In the same report, Oxfam suggested that the richest 80 individuals in the world owned the same value of assets as the bottom 50% of the world's population. The richest 80 people has the same wealth as the poorest 3.5 billion. There's a problem about all of how you use all of the statistics, but it is necessary to put them starkly like that. I just confine myself to saying, for the purpose of what I have to say this morning, is that none of this is inevitable. Yes, it is sometimes presented in a kind of a medievalist way as the way the world is, that this is a frame within which we must make our best efforts, and it cannot change. Can change? It must change. And humanity, in the end, we are faced with the question as to where we stand on such issues. That inequality was made manifest to me in the most fundamental of human outcomes last year when I visited Malawi, a country where, despite the Green Revolution in food production and the wonderful advances in vaccination and public health, very, very significantly over the past half century, it remains today with a life expectancy of less than 55 years. 16 years less than the global average, 24 years less than the United States, 26 years less than Ireland. So I think the advances in the lifestyle, living standards and life expectancy of the wealthy of our planet in the past century is indeed remarkable. And we owe much to the advances that have been made in science and technology and in medicine. But the gap with those in poorer nations in terms of income, however imperfectly that is measured, remains staggering. In fact, superfluous consumption in the richest and in the expanding economies is exacerbating the disadvantages of the poorest. The near insatiable demand as wants for some parts of humanity are affecting the sufficiency of meeting the needs of the many. This is very interesting. I think it is the Skidelsky's father and son who have produced literature on this about the significant point it is in the history of humanity when you move from needs to wants, when you move, if you like, from sufficiency to insatiability. And through climate change and the depletion of natural resources, populations in the global south are paying the price for the lifestyles and economic models in ascendancy in the north. Desertification, soil degradation, water contamination, increased frequency of storms and other extreme weather events are all caused by climate change resulting from emissions, to a large part in the industrialized world, and all are affecting disproportionately the poorest regions, who are deprived very often of the capacity to respond, strangled by debt, and often too excluded from the benefits of science and technology, not only in food security, but in health itself. There is thus an historical and context to climate change and to the challenges that we face today. And they are derived in part from the level and form of inequality that is presented to us as the shape of the world today. Tragically, frequently and too often, as the inevitable shape of the world in which we live. In relation to climate change, specific forms of industrialization in particular regions of the planet have been the main drivers of the process of climate change. Of course, and I mentioned it earlier, in deep history, colonialism, conflict and domination, in military, political and economic forms, all form the background to the current distribution of resources. In the moral sense, we cannot begin our current response from any fictional clean state. We have legacy issues for acknowledgement and response. And if we are to move to a new interdependency that is ethical and enduring, rather like it is essential as a process of healing, that we face our past. I sometimes look at the map of Africa in the 19th century, and you look at the European presence on it, and you look at the purpose of those migrations into that continent of Africa. And then you think of today, and we think of migrants coming from Africa. What is the purpose of the most recent arrivals, and how does it contrast with the intentions and assumptions of those who ransacked Africa and drew lines on the sand in the 19th century? I say that isn't something that should destroy us, but you must acknowledge, if you like, the legacy of empire if you're going to have a post-imperialist presence. So inequality has specific roots, and if we are to set about addressing it and constructing new models of sustainable development, there must be an acceptance of the history and the responsibility of those regions, nations and peoples who find themselves in a position of relative advantage due to such historical processes that have in turn had the effect of disadvantaging and condemning others. We cannot continue to see all of these challenges in some kind of non-political way, as amenable to the solutions and solely as some kind of enlightened technocracy. These issues are political, and absence of accountability is an exercise of power, albeit by stealth, and such an abuse of power can be brought to bear on state institutions and decisions, but also downstream, too, on foundations and NGOs who may be dependent on private funding in the absence of adequate state report. I want to suggest in this magnificent university that the integrity of science itself is crucially connected to the funding of the public university. There is need for us to consider the moral and ethical issues that are raised, of course, by the destruction of the environment, in terms of the fundamental interest, too, of future generations. The principles of climate justice requires of this generation, knowing now, as we all do, that climate change will have devastating effects on future generations, not to violate their interests, these future generations, and to avoid causing them unnecessary suffering. And just as we owe a debt to those who are the victims of past exploitation, we owe a debt to those who might be the future victims of our actions or inactions now. Informed then by such a moral view, we must adjust our life choices. We must adjust them accordingly to take into account the requirements of intergenerational justice. This demands a pluralism of approach in theoretical modeling of the problems and an integration of the knowledge sources and teaching. A requirement, I have to say, for which the prospects may be fading in many of the universities who are narrowing their focus. The central moral challenge of both the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change then is one of justice. And while there is broad scientific agreement over what is necessary, what might be done in relation to it reducing emissions, for example, at a global level, how responsibility can be fairly apportioned between states and regions is the subject of much contention, and it is an area for which we have yet to achieve agreement. And similarly, while goals and targets to address objectives in the area of nutrition, healthcare, access to water have been agreed, how these will be resourced remains unclear. There's an interesting document from the World Bank, From Billions to Trillions, and then it raises the issue, how do you make that transition? And the suggestion is it will come from private sources as well as the states and from international commitments. And then you look at these different streams that are projected and you ask how many of them are bringing human rights and ecological rights responsibilities with them. There is a demand as well, I think, if we are to achieve progress in this area. These issues, I repeat, are issues that are not ones amenable solely to technocratic resolution. They are political, and they require political awareness, advocacy, and action. And there is a demand, I think, too, in order to make this possible, for citizens' conscientization and, if you like, moral courage and activism. Global inequality, you see, is also about much more than a failure of policy, or indeed, as I have been describing it, the restitution of the inherited wealth gap. It represents, frankly, I say it in a university, an intellectual crisis, and it is one that demands new ideas and new thinking. That our existing models of economics and development have not produced the outcomes that some may have hoped for in closing the gap between what have been described as developed and developing nations is, of course, irrefutable. We have become trapped, I suggest, in a narrow paradigm of de-peopled growth in what we call the developed world, sourced in an earlier myth of that linear progress I spoke about, a myth which privileged a narrow model of human consumption over the needs of the whole vulnerable planet in which we live. Increasingly, this model of insatiable, with its assumptions, if you like, often undeclared in theoretical terms. When I was a young student, and I remember in Illinois, being moved by middle-range theory and Alvin Goulner's wonderful work about saying, you must declare your domain assumptions. What are you bringing to the table in relation to your work? This has slipped away, where it is no longer necessary to declare the assumptions in the theoretical models which are being presented singularly as a single hegemonic source for policy. Great example of it, of course, is in relation to the implications of austerity models in economics in the 28 countries of the European Union at the present time. Increasingly, this model, as I've said, is prioritizing the wants of the few over the needs of the many. And what happens then as a result, in conditions of passivity, quiescence, and often a kind of serious, it can even come to a scholarly quiescence and even collusion, we get a kind of social and political crisis of legitimacy, as well as a scientific and environmental crisis. How are we to discuss with effect and with the possibility of making change the dominant economic model of our time, and specifically of the period since the 1990s, is discredited and can no longer be sustainably maintained. And I think solutions proposed within that model are doomed to failure, be it in social terms, as far as addressing unemployment or poverty, or in environmental terms, as a strategy for adequately addressing climate change. It is very interesting, some fine work is taking place within the model. I think in terms of inequality, the work of Robert Reich, I think the work of Sir Anthony Atkinson, I think of the work of Amartya Sen. But I have to say that authenticity suggests that I have to say to you, I see problems within the model itself, and I think it stops short of the paradigm shift that we need. Because central to the model of neoliberal economics, to which I've been referring, which has become dominant, is a mythic view of technological advancement as a means of enrichment. In this view, nature and its resources, and I have quoted Francis Bacon before, are defined as both unlimited and quantifiable commodities for the production process. But absent from this model is a consideration of the consequences that arise both from the production process itself and for the sustainability, or alternatively the destruction, of aspects of our mutual coexistence on this vulnerable planet. Now, many difficulties have flowed, I think, from a confusion in economics and subsequently in development theory, whereby instruments that are, if you like, part of measurement, calculability, and they are derived from mathematical models. They are a legitimate part of economics. The difficulty is that instruments are presented as method or occasionally as a theoretical justification for policy. And this is simply bad scholarship. It is lazy scholarly work, frankly. I think a false dichotomy then. The issue is not one, if you like, of any antipathy either to those of us who are interested in normative theory. It is one of intellectual rigor itself. And then too, very often, a popular false dichotomy is created between what are presented as the hard concerns of this new version of economics and scientists and the alleged soft concerns of those in the social environmental sciences or the humanities who are concerned with human and environmental aspects of growth, or with the ideological context in which science is taught and practiced, or the context in which technology is delivered. I call this a false dichotomy. It is not inevitable, of course. Paradigms have shifted in physics. within a short period of intellectual time. But I think as well too, and I do acknowledge it, there have been leading scientists who were concerned with these ethical questions. They are there in environmental science, in meteorology, in marine biology that I know of, indeed in all areas of fundamental research. These voices, unfortunately, when raised, have very often been marginalized, and science came to be seen as instrumental, or even as serving as some kind of under-laborer role to a narrow version of economy. And thus we became dependent on destructive technologies, including those based on fossil fuels. At the same time, we are not required to concede, and it would be wrong to resile to any superficial association of technology and, if you like, with destruction of the environment, or of allowing science to be presented as being necessarily antithetical to the concerns of conservation. Such a view would miss the great legacy and potential, both in terms of environmental sustainability and human development, that scientific innovation can provide when harnessed be a wonderful resource for good. Yes, it is possible to decouple an uncritical use of technology from an obsolete and failed model of development. We must, I argue, recapture the potential of technology derived from fundamental and applied science as a key form of wealth that will be harnessed for public good and allow it to be emancipatory. Appropriate technology is a resource, I am certain, that can empower poor nations to meet their development needs and address the threats posed by climate change. And while the focus of the Sustainable Development Goal process to date has largely been on financial resources, in both this process and the forthcoming climate change talks in Paris, which we're preparing, poorer nations are also calling for access to technology that will allow them to control their own sustainable development. Indeed, models of development which have been weighted too heavily on financial transfers risk perpetuating an asymmetric power between donors and recipients. Similarly, simplistic arguments that opening up trade between North and South, in enabling others, if you like, to have the lifestyle of some of our elites already have, will raise all boats, ignores the reality of open trade as we know it to date in the context of some absolutely pronounced power imbalances. Aid and trade are and will remain important as sites of change, but empowerment is the key to sustainable and just development. And what we need to support and facilitate in Africa and in other poorer regions is a model of sustainable development that creates employment, develops indigenous industry, builds infrastructure, and addresses the acute needs of the people, all within the context of what are now urgent climate change and demands. It is from Africa we all came, but when I think of the Africa that is to come, by 2050, the population of Africa will have doubled. Today, half of the population of the continent of Africa is under the age of 25. In the proportion of what is the fertile land surface which can produce food, 65% of it is in Africa. And then again, in relation to that, what an impertinence it would be to suggest that it is Africa, this young continent of the future, will be modeled, developed in the same way as we have brought ourselves to the sorry state, to the position we have been in ourselves. I think that this is ambitious, what is possible in Africa, but with the tools that are available to us through modern technology, we have the capacity to enable such a new model to come into existence, to emerge, always remembering that Africa has a history and will have a future that will appropriately be defined and decided by Africans. Very early on in my political career in Africa in the 1970s, I remember somebody suggesting to me, this is where so-and-so discovered the Nile. And the suggestion occurred to me primitively, was it not there before? But just as with inherited climate debt and the obligations arising from the history of colonization, the question of historical legacy also applies in the context of technology. The head start in technological innovation, enjoyed by wealthy nations and derived from their development advantage, must be recognised responsibly and lead to an equalisation of opportunity in the future rather than to a consolidation of existing advantages and asymmetries. The concept of technology justice speaks to these legacy issues and calls for a system of access to technology that is available to all people, an access that will assist them in meeting their needs without compromising the ability of others and of future generations to do the same. The question of access is central in technology, and we have a choice to make available the benefits of science in a spirit of solidarity and under the ethic of sharing the benefits of advances in knowledge and understanding, or to reduce knowledge itself to a tradable commodity, which becomes another dimension in the imbalance and inequalities we have inherited from history. And this raises issues, of course, for the ethical delivery of scientific work. I've often thought myself that the migration of scientists and scientific teams is so different, if you like, to corporately encapsulated or captured scientists whose work is very often mediated through corporate choices that are not accountable. The British Nobel Prize-winning pharmacologist James Black addressed this question when he wrote, in terms of the ethics of research, he wrote, "In the culture I grew up in, you did your work and you did not put your arm around it to stop other people from looking. You took the earliest possible opportunity to make knowledge available." What we can see in the developing world is that the best results are produced where the benefits of science and technology are delivered within a citizenship model rather than a consumer model, or a model that enhances elites at the cost of the majority of the people. It is best where research and technology programs are conceived and delivered in conjunction with local and state authorities. It is worth adding, by the way, that the greatest long-term paradigm-changing advances have come from investment in fundamental scientific research, freed from the narrow confines of applied and instrumental research that have to be delivered within a dateline established by shareholding and chief executive officers rewarded by bonuses. I think in the service of industry, freed from such narrow confines or a limited lifespan structured solely around market exploitation, and state-funded fundamental research in science has been the founding source, is a founding source of what has changed our world for the better in so many different ways. It is worth considering just two areas in which technology, and this is the good news, is already empowering sustainable development. I refer to nutrition and healthcare, partly stemming from our own history in Ireland. 3 million people affected by a famine in a 3-year period in the 19th century. Ireland has taken on a role as a global leader in the fight against global hunger, and it founded with others the Scaling Up Nutrition movement in 2010. This brings together all stakeholders to tackle hunger and undernutrition, donors and developing partners, and we have 42 so far. United Nations and other international organizations and agencies, and international financial institutions, some civil society and business organizations too. And particular attention is paid to maternal, infant and child undernutrition. And Ireland has formed a strong partnership with the United States known as the 1,000 Days Partnership on advocating for good nutrition in the first 1,000 days of a child's life, from pregnancy to the age of 2. A critical window for growth and development. But here also other ethical issues arise, also remembering, for example, that breastfeeding would save 1.5 million babies' lives in any 1 year on our planet at the present time, and is crucial for eliminating forms of dependency. As a key part of that programme, in which Ireland is giving leadership, has scaled up support for research and extension initiatives, focusing on boosting the agricultural productivity of poor smallholder farmers, with a particular focus on those women who in West Africa produce 80% of the additional growth, women farmers. This obviously includes improved seed varieties, but it is not dependent on varieties that are protected by monopolized patents. And here again another issue arises. Yes, it is possible to prove seeds, but it is possible to do so without creating a damaging monopoly. The programme also focuses on planting materials, improving soil fertility, diversifying crops, linking to markets through communications technology, and enhancing resilience against climate shocks. In this programme, Ireland stresses it is essential that research is accessible to and used by poor farmers in their fields, helping them to grow foods for their families. We recognise too in agriculture that the integrity of the product is important, but equally so is the integrity of farming as a cultural activity, and particularly in the context I've been referring to as one in which women are participating. It is important that we prioritise the importance of sustaining the life of the farming community. In all of these areas, agri-science is being put to the service of populations in those countries facing the greatest risk of malnutrition and its associated effects such as stunting of child growth. Access to the necessary scientific knowledge is delivered through state agencies and universities, and this is then combined with local expertise and understanding of cultural and other location-specific contexts to ensure the best results. This source of scientific knowledge differs from unaccountable strategies that can create a new dependency, or indeed what would eventually be a new form of colonialism. In the area of healthcare, access to affordable retroviral medication is but one such striking example of how, empowered with access to the benefits of medical research in a state-driven and universal healthcare system, remarkable achievements are possible. However, the history of struggle in achieving access to this technology in countries like South Africa also demonstrates the potential for conflict between market-driven and universal models of access and delivery. And of course, these issues once again tell us that these issues are both inescapably political and moral. Now again, one might ask, for example, a more recent example is that Ebola-stricken countries of Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, who are continuing to pay interest payments on debt priority and forced to give it priority over spending on a necessary health infrastructure that might prevent a further outbreak. And also, it is taking precedence, when I look at the figures, over food systems and education in each of the three countries. In South Africa, the Treatment Action Campaign had to fight all the way to the Constitutional Court to secure access to antiretroviral treatment as a socio-economic right. And in so doing, they had to confront multinational pharmaceutical companies who they accused of profiteering by keeping the price of drugs high, arguing that this conflicted with the right to life. The question of access to essential medication reminds us again of the wider question of the conflict between technology as commodity and technology as public good, a tension that is often expressed through the prism of intellectual property rights, and the use of the concept of rights in this context is contentious on a number of levels, which are held by private corporations in the north and which are in conflict with the interests of industries and governments in the south that are seeking to utilize or build on the relevant technology. There is no point in avoiding this issue. And at the third Finance for Development Conference in Addis Ababa in July of this year, which acted as a prelude to the Sustainable Development Summit in New York, this conflict came into the open towards the end of the negotiations as a central point of tension between the different regional blocs. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the agreement which emerged from that conference, recognizes that the technology divide across a wide range of economic sectors makes it difficult for developing countries to achieve sustainable development. And this was a definitive acknowledgement of the righteousness of the claim of technology justice. As a response and in order to help facilitate development, transfer, and dissemination of technologies relevant for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, member states agreed to establish a technology facilitation mechanism consisting of a United Nations interagency task system, an annual collaborative multi-stakeholder forum on science, technology, and innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals, and an online platform. At first reading, these steps strike me as inadequate, and they are seen by most as modest at best. But we had to agree on something. It remains to be seen how they will interact with agreements in other spheres and emerging from other processes. However, these new structures do provide, and I stay positive, a framework in which a new ethic of science must be given expression, one in which the benefits and riches of knowledge and discovery should be available to and usable by all of humanity, and with respect for the welfare of our planet and the species with which we share it. This question, then, of control and regulation of resources towards the creation of a global commons of knowledge and technology also can extend to essential natural resources, mineral wealth and the sea, which can be regarded as part of humanity's common wealth. Indeed, while we need to ensure that states and populations have access to common resources when addressing their development needs, we must also ensure that they can assert control over and maintain their own indigenous resources at the same time. It should be one of the instruments within the development packages that resources, for example, are made available to small coastal states that will enable them to vindicate their people's rights under the law of the sea. The vision of the Sustainable Development Goals, then, is, I suggest, one of common humanity, with universal objectives for achieving human dignity for all. It has been an essential step towards that cathartic vision. It is, I think, which is a wonderful vision of a science without borders, where discovery and innovation are not bordered by time or sovereignty, and certainly not by monopoly, where the genius of scientific discovery can be to the glory and benefit of all humanity. And the benefits, I believe, of such a genius can be put in the service, to the service of either an aggressive competition between us, or something more splendid. Alternatively, it can be put to the service of solidarity and cooperation. That is our choice. That is your choice. And that is what constitutes our possibility. And the spirit of the public university is in the spirit of such solidarity, and it is emancipatory. And I urge you all to play your part in advancing this claim that science be put in the service of sustainable development for all, because I believe it will enable you to live the fulfilling life of hope and love that I wish for you all. Gormil Mahdi.